Some moments in life creep up on you when you least expect them. They start as nothing, just another night, another conversation. But then, before you even realize it, everything shifts. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't even thinking. But when Nick took me in the kitchen that night, when his voice dropped just a little lower, when the space between us felt tighter than it should have, I knew. I knew everything was about to change. I never thought I'd find myself here. Never. If you told me a year ago, even a week ago, that I'd be sitting here, telling this story, I would have laughed. But life doesn't give you warnings. It just happens. And when it does, you can either walk away or let it take you under. I always thought I knew where I stood. I believed in boundaries, in doing what's right. But loneliness? Loneliness changes everything. It makes you see things differently. It makes you crave things you shouldn't. And worst of all, it twists your reality until you don't even recognize yourself. That night in the dim kitchen, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't lonely anymore. I was seen. And that is how it all began. What happened that night? What did I do? What did he do? Stay with me till the end, and you'll understand why I've never been the same. If you've ever found yourself in a moment you never expected, tell me in the comments. And if you're ready for the truth, the whole truth, subscribe. Because this is a story you won't forget. My home wasn't always this quiet. It wasn't always filled with silence so thick, it pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. There was a time when laughter bounced off the walls. When footsteps echoed down the hall, quick and light, when voices overlapped in the kitchen, talking over one another, filling the air with life. But now all I had was empty space. A husband who barely looked at me anymore. A man who once held my face in his hands like I was the most precious thing in the world, but now he could go days without speaking to me. His words, when they did come, were clipped, cold, functional. Like I was a shadow in his life, not his wife. I tried to hold on to something, anything. I cooked his favorite meals. I wore the perfume he used to love. I sat next to him on the couch, waiting, hoping he would reach for me. But he never did. Eventually, I stopped trying. That was the worst part. Not the distance. Not the silence. The way I just accepted it. The way I convinced myself that this was what marriage became. A quiet house, two strangers living under the same roof. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was fine, that I didn't need to feel wanted anymore. Until Nick. Nick wasn't supposed to mean anything. He was just there, part of the background of my life. A familiar presence, steady, reliable. He was around when my husband wasn't. He saw me when my husband didn't. At first, I didn't notice it. Or maybe I did, but I pushed it aside. The way his eyes lingered just a second too long. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, like he was careful with his words, like he actually cared how they landed. I ignored the way my pulse quickened when I heard him walk into a room. I ignored the way my stomach tightened when I caught his gaze across the dinner table. I told myself it was nothing, because it had to be nothing. But the thing about loneliness, it makes you hyper-aware of the smallest things. A touch that lingers. A glance that lasts a second too long. A voice that sounds a little warmer than it should. Nick had been in my house so many times before. He had moved through my kitchen, my living room, passed by me in the hallway. It should have felt normal. But that night, standing in that kitchen, with the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of the television playing in the other room, nothing felt normal. I don't even remember what we were talking about. Something small. Something meaningless. But the way he looked at me, the way his body leaned just slightly toward mine, it wasn't meaningless. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. I felt seen. I told myself it was innocent. I told myself I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew. Something had shifted. And there was no going back. It was late. The kind of late where the house felt different, quieter, heavier. My husband had gone to bed hours ago, the way he always did, without a word, without a glance, as if I wasn't even there. I sat in the living room for a while, staring at nothing, listening to the faint sounds of the night pressing in from outside. The distant hum of passing cars. The occasional creak of the house settling. The silence between it all felt louder than anything else. I wasn't tired. Or maybe I was, but not in a way that sleep could fix. So I got up. I walked into the kitchen, barefoot, the tile cold against my skin. The dim light over the stove cast soft shadows along the counters. It was just me, just the quiet, just the empty space I had grown used to. And then I wasn't alone. Nick walked in. I heard him before I saw him, the soft shuffle of his footsteps against the floor. My pulse did something strange, something I refused to acknowledge. I glanced up, forcing a small smile. Couldn't sleep? He shook his head, stepping toward the fridge. Nah, just wanted some water. His voice was low, quiet, like he didn't want to disturb the stillness around us. Or maybe he felt it too, that shift in the air. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching as he grabbed a glass. It was nothing, just a moment. Just two people standing in a kitchen, filling the silence with small talk. But then, he turned to me, glass in hand, and said something I didn't expect. You seem different lately. I blinked, caught off guard. Different? He nodded, studying me, his gaze steady. Yeah, quieter. Like you're always somewhere else. I let out a soft laugh, but it was forced, awkward. I guess I just have a lot on my mind. He didn't look away. I've noticed. There was something about the way he said it. Something in the way he held my gaze, not looking away, not brushing past the moment the way most people would. It was too knowing, too careful. I should have changed the subject. I should have laughed it off and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, feeling the warmth of his attention settle over me like something I had forgotten I needed. The tension was subtle, but it was there. A shift. A crack in the wall I had spent years building. And then, his hand brushed against mine. It was small, barely a touch, just the lightest graze of fingers as he passed me the glass. But it was enough. Enough to make my breath catch. Enough to make my skin prickle with awareness. I told myself it was nothing. That I was imagining it. But when I looked up at him, really looked, I saw it in his eyes. He felt it too. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't nothing. This was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. I barely slept that night. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind trapped in an endless loop of what just happened. Was that just in my head? Did I imagine the way his fingers brushed mine? The way he looked at me, like he saw something my husband hadn't seen in years? Was I reading too much into it? Or was there something there? I turned onto my side, facing the empty space beside me. My husband was there, his back turned, breathing steady, deep in sleep. Unbothered. Unaware. He hadn't even noticed I was gone. I closed my eyes, but I could still feel it. The warmth of Nick's hand. The way my pulse had quickened. That moment of hesitation, his eyes on mine, unspoken words hanging in the air. It was just harmless talk, wasn't it? Just a conversation. Just a fleeting moment in a kitchen. But then, why couldn't I stop thinking about it? Why did my skin still burn where his fingers had touched mine? I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it did nothing to quiet the unease creeping through me. This wasn't me. I wasn't the kind of woman who played with fire, who let her mind wander into places it shouldn't go. And yet, I hadn't felt this alive in years. I had spent so long being invisible that I forgot what it felt like to be noticed, to be seen, to be wanted. My husband barely spoke to me anymore, barely touched me. I was nothing more than an afterthought to him, a presence in the house, a fixture in the background. He had stopped seeing me as a woman, and now here was Nick, seeing me, and I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I liked it. I craved it. I turned onto my back again, exhaling slowly, guilt pressing down on me like a weight. This was wrong. I was married. It didn't matter how neglected I felt. It didn't matter how lonely I was. I had made vows, promises. But the problem with loneliness? It doesn't care about vows. It doesn't care about promises. It whispers in your ear, telling you that you deserve to feel something again. That you deserve to be seen, to be touched, to be wanted. And the worst part? I was starting to believe it. I shook my head, forcing myself to breathe. I needed to stop this. I needed to stop thinking about him. I needed to pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, I already knew. It was too late. I should have stayed away from him. I should have recognized the danger that first night in the kitchen, the way my breath caught, the way my skin tingled where his hand had brushed mine. I should have walked away, shut it down before it had a chance to grow. But I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lie. Because the next night, I found myself listening, waiting to hear his footsteps again. And when I did, I didn't stop myself from going to the kitchen. It became a habit. A quiet, secret rhythm we both fell into. Long after my husband went to bed, after the rest of the house had settled into silence, I would drift into the kitchen. And every time, as if he knew I would be there, Nick would follow. At first, we told ourselves it was just coincidence. Just two people who couldn't sleep, passing the time with small talk and cups of tea. But small talk became something else. It became longer glances, lower voices, closer spaces. I started noticing things about him that I hadn't before. The way his eyes lingered on me, studying, searching, like he was trying to understand something I couldn't say out loud. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, like he knew how fragile I was, how much I needed someone to speak to me like I mattered. The way he positioned himself just close enough for me to feel the heat of his body, but never too close. Never enough to cross the line. And I should have stopped it. Every time I felt my pulse quicken, every time I found myself leaning in, I told myself, this is wrong. This is dangerous. But the truth? I didn't want to stop. The nights stretched longer. We talked about everything, things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. My childhood. My dreams. My fears. Things I thought no one cared to hear anymore. And Nick, he listened. Really listened. Not like my husband, who only nodded absently, distracted, barely registering my presence. Nick looked at me. Spoke to me like I was the most important thing in the room. And that was dangerous. Because the more he looked at me that way, the more I started seeing him differently too. I noticed the way his lips curved when he smiled. The way his arms tensed when he leaned against the counter. The way his voice dipped lower when he said my name. I told myself it was harmless. It was just talk. Just company. Just two lonely people filling the silence. But one night, something changed. We were standing by the counter, our voices hushed, the air between us thick with something neither of us had spoken out loud. I reached for a cup. He reached at the same time. Our hands met. And this time, neither of us pulled away. We stood there, frozen, our fingers touching, our breaths shallow, the space between us vanishing. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the way his pulse quickened just like mine. I should have stepped back. I should have ended it there. But instead, I lifted my eyes to his. And what I saw everything I had been missing. Want. Need. Something deep, something neither of us had spoken, something we both knew we couldn't have. He exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering down to my lips before meeting my eyes again. I felt it then. That invisible pull. The kind of pull that ruins people. He didn't move. He didn't push. He just waited. And for the first time in a long time, I felt wanted. The moment stretched, holding us there, suspended in something too real, too dangerous, too inevitable. Then, finally, Nick took a step back. The air shifted. Reality came crashing in. He cleared his throat, looked away. I gripped the counter, my heart pounding. Neither of us said a word, because we both knew. We were already too far gone. It was late again. The kind of late where the world felt different, like time had slowed, like reality had slipped into something dangerous and unspoken. The house was quiet, the same silence I had come to know so well. My husband was asleep, just down the hall, breathing in the rhythm of a man who had stopped noticing the woman beside him long ago. I should have gone to bed. I should have stayed in that empty, hollow space next to him and pretended I wasn't suffocating. But instead, I went to the kitchen. I told myself it was for water. I told myself it was habit. But I knew the truth. I knew that in a few moments, Nick would be there too. And I let it happen. I stood by the counter, fingers curled around the edge, my breathing unsteady, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and want. Then, footsteps. Slow, measured. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I felt him. The air shifted, the space between us suddenly too small, too charged. He stopped behind me, close enough that I could feel his warmth, close enough that my pulse pounded against my ribs. Neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched thick and unbearable. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to step away, to break whatever spell had been tightening around us for weeks. I should leave. I should walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I turned around. And there he was. So close. Too close. His eyes locked onto mine, dark, searching. His breath was shallow, just like mine. I could see it, the same hesitation, the same war raging inside him. He shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be standing this close. But we were. And neither of us moved. My fingers trembled on the counter. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might give me away. His gaze flickered downward, just for a second. To my lips. Then back to my eyes. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my entire body burning with something I couldn't name. I knew this moment was a cliff's edge. One step forward, and there would be no turning back. Nick exhaled, a slow, shaky breath, his hand lifting slightly before he curled his fingers into a fist and dropped it again. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. But suddenly, there wasn't space between us anymore. His hand brushed against my arm, slow, deliberate. Testing. I shuddered, eyes fluttering shut for just a second, long enough to feel it, the warmth, the undeniable pull, the weight of everything we weren't saying. His fingers curled around my wrist, light at first, then firmer, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I felt his breath against my cheek, warm, unsteady. He whispered my name. Soft, like a confession. Like a sin. I let out a shaky breath, my body betraying me, leaning into him ever so slightly, like I had lost all control of my own movements. And then, his lips brushed against my skin. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just a moment. A slow, torturous moment where his mouth lingered just too close, where his breath ghosted over my jaw, where my entire body tensed, waiting for something I shouldn't want. My hands lifted on instinct, on need, pressing against his chest. Not pushing him away. Not pulling him closer. Just holding. Feeling. His heart was racing beneath my palm, just as fast as mine. We weren't just crossing a line. We were obliterating it. And in that moment, that single, breathless moment, I knew I was already his. And I wasn't sorry. The next morning, everything was different. The house looked the same. The walls, the furniture, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, it was all exactly as it had been the day before. But I wasn't. I felt it the second I opened my eyes. A sinking, twisting feeling deep in my stomach. A weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that last night hadn't happened. That I had imagined it. That the heat of Nick's breath against my skin, the feel of his fingers gripping my wrist, the unspoken need hanging in the air between us, none of it was real. But it was. And now I had to live with it. I turned my head slightly, glancing toward the other side of the bed. My husband was there, still asleep, his breathing deep and even. Unbothered. Unaware. I watched him for a moment, searching for something: guilt, anger, suspicion. But there was nothing. He was the same as always. Distant. Detached. And somehow, that made it worse. I forced myself out of bed, my movements slow, careful, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile reality I was trying to hold together. I walked past the mirror without looking. I couldn't. I didn't want to see myself. I didn't want to face what I had done. I went to the kitchen, my heart hammering, my stomach twisting. I told myself I was just making coffee, that I wasn't looking for him, that I wasn't waiting for Nick to appear. But then, footsteps. Slow, measured. I felt it before I saw him. The shift in the air. The quiet tension curling around me like a noose. And then, he was there. Standing in the doorway, watching me. Everything inside me tightened. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stared into my coffee cup, gripping the counter, willing my hands to stay steady. Morning, his voice was low, casual. Too casual. I swallowed hard. Morning. Silence. I could feel his eyes on me, searching, waiting. Did he regret it? Did he feel the same pounding guilt sitting heavy in my chest? Or was he as unchanged as he seemed? I finally forced myself to turn, just enough to meet his gaze. A mistake. Because the second our eyes locked, my breath caught. The knowing look. The unspoken words. He knew. And I knew. There was no taking it back. No pretending. I tore my gaze away, gripping my coffee cup tighter, my hands cold despite the warmth of the ceramic. I felt exposed, raw, as if I had been peeled open and every hidden thought, every buried desire was suddenly on display. But Nick? Nick was steady, controlled, like nothing had changed, like he was waiting for me to break. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor made me flinch. I turned quickly to see my husband sitting at the table, rubbing his temples, oblivious to the tension choking the air between Nick and me. He didn't look at me. Didn't notice the way my fingers shook as I reached for the sugar. He just sighed, checked his phone, and mumbled something about work. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Because as I stood there, trapped between the two of them, my husband, who didn't see me at all, and Nick, who saw too much, the weight of the secret settled deeper into my bones. Unbearable. I needed space. I needed to breathe. But as I stepped away, as I moved past Nick, I felt it, a touch. Subtle. Fleeting. His fingers brushed against mine just long enough to remind me. This wasn't over. And I had no idea how to stop it. What have I done? I keep asking myself that over and over, but there's no answer that makes it better. No way to spin it into something less than what it is. I crossed a line. I let something happen that should have never even been a thought in my mind. And now I can't take it back. I sit alone in the dark, my fingers curled around the blanket draped over my lap, staring at the dim light seeping in from the street outside. My husband is asleep in the other room, just like every night before. Nothing has changed for him. But for me, everything has changed. I feel different. I am different. And I hate myself for it. I always thought I knew exactly who I was. I believed in right and wrong, in loyalty, in the kind of love that withstands time and distance and silence. I used to think I was a good person, a faithful wife. Now, I see someone else in the mirror, someone I don't recognize, someone I'm ashamed of. And yet, when I close my eyes, all I can feel is Nick's touch. All I can hear is the way he said my name. All I can remember is that look in his eyes, the one that shattered every excuse I had been telling myself. Was it worth it? For a moment, it was. For that one brief, reckless moment, when my heart was pounding and my skin was burning and my body forgot about the weight of guilt waiting on the other side, it was worth it. And that terrifies me. Because if it was worth it once, what's stopping it from happening again? I tell myself I should confess. That if I were truly sorry, I would tell my husband the truth. That I would let this marriage fall apart the way it's already been falling for years. That I would face the consequences of my choices instead of hiding behind a life that no longer feels real. But I know I won't. Because the thought of losing everything is worse than the guilt. So instead, I bury it. I carry it alone, letting it settle deep in my bones, letting it twist and tangle inside me until I can barely breathe. I keep waiting for the guilt to become stronger than the temptation, for the regret to drown out the lingering thrill. But it doesn't. At night, when the house is quiet and my husband is asleep, when I am alone with nothing but my own thoughts, I replay it. I feel it all over again. And I wonder, was this a mistake I can still undo? Or was it already too late the moment I let him touch me? Loneliness is dangerous. It sneaks up on you, quiet and slow, wrapping itself around your life until you don't even notice it's there. Until it's all you know. Until it changes you into someone you never thought you'd become. It makes you crave things you shouldn't. It blurs the line between right and wrong, twisting your thoughts, making you justify the unjustifiable. It whispers lies, telling you that you deserve more, that you need more, that just one moment of feeling alive again will fix what's been broken inside you for so long. But the worst part? You believe it. You believe it because the silence in your life is louder than your own conscience. You believe it because, for the first time in too long, you feel something. And by the time you realize what you've done, by the time the weight of your choices finally catches up to you, it's too late. Some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. Some choices stay with you forever. I don't know if I can ever go back to who I was before. I don't know if I even want to. But I do know this. There's no such thing as a harmless moment. There's no such thing as just talking. Because it always starts small. A glance, a touch, a conversation that lasts a little too long. And then, before you even realize it, you're standing at the edge of something you can't undo. And the worst part? You don't want to step back. You tell yourself you should. You tell yourself you will. But deep down, you already know you won't. So now, I turn to you. Have you ever found yourself in a moment you never expected? A situation where your emotions took over logic? What would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think, if it made you question, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because the truth is, stories like this happen every day. People cross lines they swore they never would. And sometimes, they never find their way back. Until next time, be careful with the lines you cross. Some, you can never erase.